Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second seminar in the Deakin Science and Society Network Healthy Future series. My name is Associate Professor Jeff Craig, and I lead the Early Life Epigenetics group within the Impact Institute, the School of Medicine at Deakin University. I also lead the Gene Equality Deakin University Research Network. My Gene Equality colleague, Associate Professor Neera Bhatia, and I are organisers of this Healthy Future seminar series. Science and Society Network was formed in 2018 in recognition that scientists and humanities and social science researchers need to work together to meet the great challenges of this century. No single academic field can bring about the changes we need to see in the world. Bridging disciplinary divides is the way to finding new solutions to the problems we face. The Science and Society Network supports early and mid-career researchers across the university who are embarking on groundbreaking interdisciplinary projects. I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which each of us are today. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Let us pause to learn, acknowledge, and celebrate their ancient histories and cultures. For those who have not attended one of our seminars so far, a quick rundown for today's event. I'll introduce the speaker, Dr. Hannah Brown. Hannah will present for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll move on to some discussion led by Dr. Jane Martin, and questions can be asked within the Q&A. So I'll be chairing this discussion on Zoom. My colleague Taufan will be moderating the YouTube live chat. We're keen to hear and very keen to hear and answer your questions. So really either post the questions into the YouTube chat or send to us on Twitter at SSN Deakin. Make sure you use the hashtags #SSN Seminar and #HealthyFutures, or just email ssn-info@deakin.edu.au. So Hannah is an Adelaide-born and educated, internationally trained researcher turned leader and communicator who leads science strategy and operations at the Victorian Heart Institute. Having trained and worked as an academic, she now sits at the interface between science and the public, helping to turn ideas into impact through storytelling. She believes that creating clear and consistent narrative, engaging broadly with consumers, authenticity, integrity, and humour are the ways to effective communication. Take it away, Hannah.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I really want to say just how grateful I am for the opportunity to speak. I've kind of known Jeff a long time. I met him in the reels at the Lawn Genome meeting a while back, probably for a few years, not too many. And so it's lovely to reconnect. I recently moved to Melbourne, and it's lovely to reconnect as Victorians now and to be able to share experiences and knowledges. So I feel really lucky to be part of this seminar program. So thank you very much for having me. I thought I would talk a little bit about storytelling today. It's something that I am immensely passionate about. Just a little disclaimer, I have two dogs that bark at almost everything here at our house at the moment, working from home. And so I'll try and mute myself if they do go mad at the postie, if he does arrive in the next hour and a half, but hopefully we get through unscathed. So I thought I would set the scene by telling you a little bit about me and a little bit about the things that are important to me. And I think that they really set the context for what I want to talk about today. And that's a bit of a word on sharing. And so when I think about sharing, I think about cake. So for people who know me well, they know I'm very passionate about cake, more passionate about cake than most other things in my life. I'm passionate particularly about good cake. I think that bad cake is criminal, and that good cake is probably something that I would consider giving up sex for. And I think you've all had a piece of cake like that. I think you've probably all had a piece of cake where you needed another piece, right? Where under no circumstances was one piece enough. In fact, you'd probably eat the whole thing given the opportunity. But during that cake experience, if you were sitting with someone that's really important to you, in this case, I think of my wife, you might share a mouthful with them. And you have to think about that for a moment, right? Because this is something that's really important to you, delicious cake. And you give some of that up. And the question is, why do you do that? Why is it that you share something that's incredibly important to you with others? And, you know, I think some people say, oh, it made me feel really good. Like I got a bit of love in my heart. And that's fine, but that's not why you do it, I don't think. The reason I would share, well, it might be the reason you do it, but the reason I would do it is because I want them to experience something that I've experienced. I want them to know about something special to me that I know about that they don't yet know about. It's really about sharing. And that's how I feel about science communication. I feel like this moment of cake sharing that I occasionally share with my wife. I don't eat a ton of cake. I don't eat as much as I would like to eat, but when I do, I hope it's really good, and I hope it's good enough to be able to share a mouthful with her. And that's what communication is about to me. It's that cake moment. It's that ability to generously share with someone else that transforms where they're at. And that's the gift that is science communication. And I wrote down here, I said SciComm gag. I think the reason I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the reality is I really dislike that as a term, and I might unpack that a bit later. But before I do that, I too want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. I acknowledge that I was actually born on Kaurna land, which is the land, the Adelaide Plains land. I'm born and raised in Adelaide. And I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, of which you are all on, recognising that everybody is probably spread across the country. And in fact, I've seen some people on the call from New Zealand. So I think that there are probably people from countries with Indigenous owners that are different to ours also. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And look, I'm really grateful. And I you know, it's one thing to pay lip service to this acknowledgement, and that is not what I'm doing here. But I want to explain to you why I'm so grateful, and why I'm grateful for those who came before me. And that really sort of connects to the reason that I'm talking to you today about storytelling, and that is that there are extraordinary storytellers around, and they probably existed a long time before me. I think if we look back at the way that knowledges have been shared, particularly Indigenous knowledges in Australia have been shared over tens of thousands of years, the reality is that storytelling forms an incredible part of that. And, you know, informations and knowledges have been transmitted in a way where they're not lost. You know, can you imagine telling a story so good it's not lost for 65,000 years? You know, that must be a good story. It's meaningful and it connects people, and it's obviously memorable, right? And so people have been doing this for a long time. It's not like these amazing stories over time have been written down. They're stories told. And, you know, so this really inspires the way that I like to go about storytelling. And so for that, I'm incredibly grateful to those who came before me. So I think a few disclosures are probably important. The major disclosures I have is that I really like storytelling. I really don't like peas. I also don't like bad cake, as I've already elucidated too. And I'm learning to play golf. I probably should disclose I'm not very good at golf, but I'm trying. And I might also disclose that I really don't like the terms STEM or SciComm, and we can unpack a bit of that perhaps if we have time today. I don't have any other relevant disclosures, and the only thing I'll probably try to sell you today is the fact that sharing is really easy. And so I thought I'd start with a bit more personal story, and that is a question to everyone to think a bit about very briefly, and that is, what's the difference between a best man's speech and science communication? So this is a picture of me and my wife at our wedding, and my brother. He wasn't the best man at my wedding. We didn't have any best people, but he did make a speech. He and I share a love, I guess, for public speaking and sharing things with people, and we always try and do it with humour. And you know, I got to thinking about what it was that he was doing in this moment, and whether it was different to science communication or not. And I really came to came to the conclusion that there wasn't really a difference between these two things. Look, there was one difference, one significant. I mean, obviously I was wearing very nice clothes, but we were probably 10 beers different to what we are today, I suspect. It was warm. It was a great night. But fundamentally, I think the goal is the same. And that is that we're just sharing another story, and we're sharing knowledge. And that's what you're hoping to achieve in, I think, all communication interactions. You're hoping to share something, whether it be a signal of warning or teaching someone something new or any one of these things. I think, and science communication can be used for all of these things. But I think you could argue that a best man's speech is also a signal, could also have a warning signal in it. You can share something new and funny and teach people new things. I don't actually think fundamentally these things are very different. And so when I like to think about science communication, I really just like to think about it as communication. I think if you can communicate well and efficiently, you can communicate about anything. And actually the scientific content is not the thing that's the most important. It's the skills that you use to transmit that information. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk a bit about today. And so I guess this is me offering up a bit of my cake, with my cake here being the things that I think are really important to communicating well and communicating about science. We will definitely talk about that. But fundamentally, I want you to think about the fact that really it is generous sharing. It's taking something that you really love, that you're very passionate about, whether that be the science that you work on or anything else, the science someone else works on, cake, and taking that and generously sharing that with someone else, despite the fact that you don't have to, right? Despite the fact that you could eat the whole cake. You could keep your knowledges to yourself, but you're choosing not to. It's an active decision, and it's a generous one. So a few little things up front. I reckon we've probably all been in a conversation or been part of some kind of broad storytelling where the person that was speaking thought that it was all about them. The reality is it's not about them, in my opinion. It's not, and these are all my opinions that you'll hear today, and some science. It's not about you. It's not about the person starting the conversation. Someone needs to start it, and that's important. But the reality is you're not more important than anyone else. And opening your mouth or writing or blogging or vlogging or any one of these things, it's not the opportunity to prove that you're smart and interesting. That's not why we're here. In fact, I would personally argue that you are almost always the least important person in the conversation. And we've laughed long and hard. In fact, before this role, I ran a comms team, and I remember joking around that, if a scientist gave a presentation in the forest and no one was there to listen, did anyone care? And I think the answer is probably no. I think when we have to think about it, the listening, the audience, they're incredibly important. In fact, they're fundamental. Like if you don't have an audience, really you're just talking to yourself. And we all know what talking to yourself looks like, and what people might imply from you doing so. So, I think we have to, right up front, for me, it's incredibly important to say you need to focus on your audience. You need to recognize it's not about you. So we're going to cover off on two things today. The two things that I think are absolutely fundamental to going about this, whether you are talking about presentations or manuscripts or grants or any one of these things. I think the same rules apply. And that is, what is the story about? What is the narrative of what you're talking about? What are you going to share? And then how do you go about telling that story? I call that person the storyteller, and I think that stories are amazing. I think it's probably, we were read a lot of books as kids. My mum was a primary school teacher, and reading formed a really important part of what we did and how we interacted. And mostly for me, my brother was not a big reader, although he's a much bigger reader these days and consumes information in other ways. But the storyteller is incredibly important, and if you want to link it back to the narrative, you can call this person the narrator. If you want to just tell a story about something else, there's lots of ways to go about that. So we talk about those two things today, and we're going to start with the narrative. And I'm not sure, these originated from the British Army, I think, around all the P's, but the proper planning for presentations and papers prevents piss poor performance. I think this can be applied to anything, and it could be applied to football. You definitely hear it applied to sport and all kinds of other things, but it applies here too, and I think thinking about what the story, this is not an in the moment thing, I don't think. I mean, you can tell a great story in the moment. You can recount something very funny that happened to you, but you want to tell a good story, a really meaningful story. This comes from practice. I think this comes from preparing and practice and working out exactly how you're going to go about it. And so I'm going to unpack a little bit of that for you through unpacking just a couple of my favourites. So you're probably all very familiar with Cinderella. You're probably equally familiar with this other beautiful story around taking a community to conceive. I'm sure you're briefed on both. Obviously, this paper is one written by a student of mine, a piece of work that I'm immensely proud of, and was really the last academic paper that I worked on before I left academia. But I would argue that these two things are very similar. And not just papers, but grants and all of these other bits and pieces, that they actually have the same components. And look, I can hear you saying these things, these might be the similarities, their sleep-inducing nature, but the reality is it is far deeper than that. And so I thought we could unpack just a little bit of that and talk about what that might look like. And so if you look up narrative and look up the key components of a narrative, you'll find anything from like 2 to 10 bits and pieces which people say are really, really important to a story. And the reality is in every story, each of these is different. These are the ones that I think really help you to tell a good story, whether it's a story about something that you did, or it's a story about your research, or a really difficult scientific component that you want to share with an audience. I think all of these same things apply, and that is that you need to set up a great story, and then you need to consider all of the components. And obviously it looks different. The character's going to be very different between your science story and some humorous story of a man falling off a scooter and his scooter flying over a bridge and into a river. Those things are going to be very different, but the same components apply. So let's talk a little about setting. Obviously, when you're setting up a story, when you're working into something for the first time, this is how people get a feeling for your story. And I think, if you think back to Cinderella, I think you all know what that setup looks like. It's not set up like the picture you see. Obviously, the story starts out about a young woman her clothes are in tatters, and she's, depending on the version of the story, perhaps in the basement, perhaps locked in the basement, kept virtually hostage, or slave-like for her stepmother, wicked stepmother and wicked stepsisters. We learn that her parents have died. I think in the original story, her mother died during childbirth, and then her father was either around or not around. And it's a sad story to begin with, right? And why is the setup like that? Because you're immediately connected to her. You immediately feel empathy and connection to the person who the story is about. You immediately want to learn more about her. You immediately want to help. You want to be part of what it is. And that's what the context and that's what the setting of the story is about. And so you have the chance to do that. It creates the mood. It creates how people feel about the story that you're talking about. And you can do this in lots of ways. It gives people that first impression of what they're going to get, which might be very different from the end. Obviously, Cinderella, we'll get to it, but it's got a happy ending, right? It's a once upon a time, where once upon a time the start of the story is tough and the end of the story is much better than that. And you have the opportunity to set that for yourself, and there are lots of ways to go about it, but setting that context and giving people background and setting them up for something amazing is really important. So I encourage you to really think about how you go about that. And the first way to go about that is your title, right? For those of you, I know that there are some non-academics on the talk today, but there are lots of academics, and for all of you academics, I'm absolutely certain that you have been to a presentation where someone got up to read the title of someone's presentation and they had to spit out the longest, most inappropriate and disgusting title you've ever heard. It's got acronyms, it's got words that they can't pronounce. It's a mouthful. And the reality is the speaker chose that. And then the speaker gets up and says, gosh, what a title. Oh, sorry about that title. And the first thing they've done to the audience is apologise. The reality is you have the option to set the scene at the beginning, right? You have the option to choose your title. Choose something good. Give these people this brilliant first impression by giving them a ripper title that you're really proud of, that really tells people about what they're going to get, or not. But don't apologize for whatever you pick. You know, if you pick something terrible, you've got to own that. But just don't pick something terrible. Pick something good. Set a brilliant move from the beginning. You are in complete control of the first impression you set. And I encourage you to think about it with your title, and I encourage you to think about it with the way that you set context for your story. Then there's the characters, right? You know, I think about this a lot, because I think about how I was taught to give a scientific presentation, or any presentation really, and you sort of you give a perhaps in the context of the background, you start outlining the characters in your story, and put this up so you can have a think about who the characters in your story might be. And they might be you, and they might be a member of the community whose personal story you're sharing about. So, you know, for example, I went to a talk this morning on spontaneous dissection of coronary arteries. It was a woman in her 50s who was featured in the story. And so the person in the characters in the story could be all different. But when we talk about scientific presentations, you know, I went through a period in my training where they said, so on this slide, you'll talk about this, and the next slide, you introduce the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. And you do like 9 slides back to back where you introduce a new thing on every slide. And those are almost always the important characters in your story. It might be a technique, it might be a protein or a gene or a process or a technology or a digital device or any one of those things. And you just do this one, then 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 this one. And you expect people to keep all of that information in their brain with no context, and then move forward in your story. Is that how real stories look? Like, do we sit down and be like, this is the wicked stepmother, this is Cinderella, this is sister 1, this is sister 2, this is the dead dad, this is the Prince Charming, this is the fairy godmother? Like, we don't do that. That's not what a story looks like. We introduce the characters when they're necessary. And so I encourage you to think about this when you're giving any kind of presentation too, to break away from that background, methods, results, hypothesis, aims, whatever order they look like. You know, whatever presentation you're giving where you think background, middle, I mean, you definitely need start, middle, end, but you need to think about how you mix up the pieces in there. And I encourage you to think about how you share information and whether it's accessible. Like, can people take on 9 pieces, 9 characters, 9 critical components of your story in the same minute? I don't think so. I think that it's much easier to grasp onto something that's important if you capture it at the time you need it. So think about how you introduce those people. Then, of course, there's the plot. There's what happens in your story. Now, I know that this picture is very small, so don't panic. I've made it much bigger so you can see all of the bits and pieces. And I think we all know these things exist within stories. I think there's the setup, then there's the rising tension, and then there's some kind of climax, and then all of a sudden there's a resolution. And each of these pieces have a really important play a really important role in your story. You know, you need rising tension because that's what connects people. That's what, you know, Cinderella sets that rising tension up right at the start. She's stuck. She's a hostage. She's a slave to these people that aren't kind to her. It sets up some tension right from the beginning. And then there's more all the way through the story. Will she get to the ball? You know, all of these things. Will she get a dress? Will the fairy godmother help her? And then all of a sudden there's the panic around, you know, will she meet the prince? Will she be able to get out of there in time before her dresses turn to rags? You know, the whole hog, right? But we get a resolution. And so each of these things are critically important for the story because each of them has a different thing, but often what they do is induce behavior. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But I think you should also ask yourself, is this linear in stories that you really like, in stories that are very memorable to you, like Cinderella? Like, is there just one setup, one rising tension, one climax, one resolution? No, there's many of these. And so think about those things when you're creating your stories, when you're telling stories to people about science, or when you're creating a presentation or writing a paper. Is it just a linear description of events, or is it, you know, is there ebbs and flows? Do we cycle back? Is there a little tension and a tiny climax and we come back and then we go again? I think these things are really important because what we know about really good stories, and I think about the best books that you've read in the last little bit, they do this all the time. That's how they keep you hanging on because you're like, oh God, what's going to happen next? You know, that's the climax, and you resolve something, but now something else is happening and there's a new rising tension. I want you to think about how you create those things for yourself. Conflict. Look, conflict is incredibly important. And I'm not talking about, punch-ons. I'm not talking about some kind of mass argument within your presentation or your story. I'm just talking about conflicts of ideas. I'm talking about creating tension by you know, it could be this or it could be this. Which one is it going to be? You know, we often do a lot of that in science, right? There are lots of opportunities where you chase down two parallel ideas or hypotheses. Use them as tension creation, you know, play one off against the other. Give people the suspense of, oh, was it that one or was it that one? Rather than saying, I tested this one, it wasn't that one, then I tested the next one. You know, think about how you craft the story. Think about how you keep people involved in the thing that you're doing. And there's lots of ways to build intrigue, and I encourage you to think about what those things look like. And then obviously there's the moral of the story, that you know, the take-home message, the key, and people love this in science, and you love it because you've seen lecturers say in the last 2 minutes, and on my last slide or in closing, and you know, everybody starts to listen and they come back, and you know, that's what we all learn when we're sort of learning to be teachers and lecturers. But that's actually not how really great stories work, generally speaking. The best messages are really subtle. I don't think at any one point there was this kabam moment in Cinderella where someone bashed the message of the story to you. And in fact, I think the message of Cinderella is probably different depending on who it is you are. You know, I think that there are stories about being kind and about luck and about things coming to people who work hard and all kinds of things, and magic. And you know, not at one point in the story, that you know, at the end of the story they don't say and they all lived happily ever after. And the moral of the story was, you know, it's not necessary, because people have taken something incredible from the story. And so I encourage you to think about how you do this with your storytelling as well. And then there's the role of you. I'm going to move on to the role of you as the storyteller, because I think those are sort of the main components that you need to sort of put together to build to create a great story. But it's one thing to have a good story, or to, you know, to craft a good story, but it's another thing to tell a great story. And so, you know, every story is different, and every storyteller is different, and everybody has a different way to go about it. And you know, I look up to famous comedians, and I think, God, I would love to be as memorable and as imposing and as, you know, hold an audience the way they do. But, you know, their job's very different to mine. You know, I talk about things that are, you know, that are quite different to the content and subject that they do. And as a result, they get paid a lot and I don't. So maybe I should think about changing content for a while. But, you know, I joke. But the role of the storyteller is incredibly important. And so I thought we'd unpack a little bit about that. And there's probably some tips and tricks in here that you can think about along the way that you can add to your storytelling tool belt, perhaps. So I think it's really important to recognize that there are many audiences, and these audiences are constantly changing. You know, the same person, after you've told them one story, they're a new audience because they know more. Their knowledge, their context knowledge is different. And so, you know, your responsibility is now to change as a storyteller, to update the story, or to tell a new story. Or to tell the story differently. And, you know, so there are lots of audiences, and audiences are really changing, but they're not hard to find. They are all in different places, and, you know, perhaps we can talk about that another day. But I want you to really focus on the audience, because it's incredibly important. You connect with each person differently. And so thinking about what that person needs and what's important to them is really important. So I'll start out with a really thing that I think is the most fundamental when it comes to being the storyteller, and that is language. And I wholeheartely believe this. You can tweet this, you can credit this to me. I'm not embarrassed to say this out loud, that exclusive elitist scientific language is for wankers. And I genuinely believe that, because I think there are so many words in the dictionary. There are so many words in use. If you can't find some that connect what it is that you do with other people, that meets them more than halfway, that generously offers up something, you're a bit of an asshole. You know, and it comes down to this, you know, to knowing who you're talking to, but also this concept of the fact that it's your responsibility. You're telling the story, and so it's your responsibility to allow them to follow, and it's not theirs to follow. And, you know, like, I messed up in this space. I was having a conversation, and I apologize if you've heard this story, but it's really fundamental to my learning. And I was having this conversation with actually someone who's now quite a famous comedian in Victoria. And I was doing what I thought was incredibly generous communicating. I thought that I was thinking about my language. I was thinking carefully. I thought I'd set up a good story, given good context. And then I said, "Are you following?" And she said, "Ada, it's not my responsibility to follow. It's your responsibility to know if I'm following and to allow me to follow." And all of a sudden I'd been completely exclusive in the way I'd gone about talking, despite the fact I was trying to be really inclusive. And it kind of broke my heart for a moment. And then I realized it was, for me, it was a turning point, the recognition that it wasn't just about the words, but it was so much more than that. And lots of people say, why is the storyteller so important? I've heard two people tell the same story and they were equally as funny, or, any one of those things. And I think it's because people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And this is definitely not a concept that this is not my concept. These are concepts that are widely available online. And this next particular one I'm going to talk about is from Simon Sinek, because I think it's incredibly important. And if you haven't watched his TED Talk on leadership, I strongly encourage you to do that. But I think it frames up why this is so important. And I don't need to create new words, new, less generous words than he used to describe a concept that's really important, and that is around purpose. And so I think that there are lots of ways to talk, as the storyteller, to talk about, the sort of ways that you might go about talking about what it is that you do. And there's sort of a fairly familiar way that we do it. And that kind of looks a bit like this. This is how most people go about it. They talk about what they do, they talk about how they do it, and maybe they unpack why. And I want to give you the example that he uses in his TED Talk, because it's very good and it's probably better than any example that I would come up with, but it's actually very relatable too. And that is the way that Apple go about it. And so if you think about talking about, if they're selling things, when we talk about science, we're selling things, we're marketing science, we're marketing new ideas and knowledges and concepts. And so they're selling computers. And, if Apple were to do it like everybody else does it, this sort of what, how, why strategy, they would say something like, "We make great computers." There's the what. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one? And so they've sort of navigated around this what and how, and they've talked a bit about what they do. But it's not that it's, I guess, uninspiring, but did you buy one from that? Probably not. The reality is, how do they go about it? Because that's not what an Apple ad sounds like. That might be what another ad sounds like, but is that what Apple sounds like? When Apple talk about it, they go about it really differently. So they might say something like, "Everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. The way we challenge the status quo is to make all of our designs beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. We just happen to make great computers." And so, I didn't make their hairs stand. I mean, I can show you the science of the hair standing up on my arms. The message is the same. They said that they were beautifully designed, that they make computers, that they're user-friendly, but they said it differently. And so the way you construct the story and the words is incredibly important. And they start with purpose. Their purpose is to change the status quo. And as a result, you feel differently. And why is that? So there isn't a ton of science. I mean, there is lots of science, because I've tested these things over and over again as we go, and there will be a bit more as we sort of pass through the last few minutes of this. But the reality is, it's biology. It's the limbic system. I think the parts of your brain that that unpack feelings and behaviour are intimately connected to the parts that are involved in decision making. I think if we look back to the history of word utilisation, you'll see that that's very clear. I think we've all said one of these things, right? It doesn't feel right. Do we feel right, or do we know right? I know in my heart. Do you? Like, is that where know starts from? Is that where you know? I've got a gut feeling. Really? Why do we use language like that? The reality is because it turns out that those parts of the brain are super intimately connected. They're more intimately connected than the rational, analytical, fact and figure, mathematical parts of our brain. And so decision-making and behaviour change are actually intimately connected to how you feel. And that's driven by purpose and connection. And so you can actually manipulate, Apple use it as a manipulative tool. marketing tool to get people to change how it is that they go about things. In this case, they're purchasing computers. They're a computer company, but the reality is you're not afraid to buy, and I'm not, a phone, a watch, all of these bits and pieces, right? You buy all of these things from them, despite the fact that they're a computer company. And so but that's not because, that they don't sell themselves as a computer company. They sell themselves as game changers, as people who change the status quo. And so each of those decisions you make matches up to their purpose, and the reason you connect with them. And so that's incredibly important when you're thinking about your story. And I think you have to also recognize that communication is a joint activity. So, I think we have all, I talked about cake earlier and I was salivating, and you may well have been, but we have all worked with someone or have a friend who can describe food in a way in which your stomach will actually gurgle and your mouth salivates. That's what this paper basically shows. And it's really important. And that is that a really good story can have someone as in the moment as you are. And this story shows, this paper shows that the way, using functional MRI imaging of the brain, looking at people's actual brain activity in real time, that if you tell a story about something and your story is so good, the parts of the brain that experience things like taste and swallowing and digestion, if you're telling a brilliant story about food, the parts of their brain light up despite the fact they're only hearing the story. And so there is this coupling of the interactions that are happening between people, and working out how to make that happen more is really important, because if they feel like they're there with you, that's what happens at the beginning of Cinderella, right? There are details that make you feel like you know what it's like to be here, or you can imagine, you have empathy for what it must be like to be in a dark basement. That's how we build connection, and that's a really important part of storytelling. I think the other, so many people, when I sit down and talk to people about these things, they always, one of the most common things I hear is, I don't really have anything interesting to say, or it's just science. And the reality is it's not that. And, this is really just a reminder that everybody is different. And that means that everybody has a unique and interesting story that connects them to why they're doing the thing that they're doing. And I encourage you to share that. The things that connect you to, whether it's, if you work on heart disease, like lots of the people near me, whether it's because you had a grandparent who died of catastrophic heart disease, or because, and you don't want that for other people, or you just want to make the world a better place. These purposes, these connections are it's not what makes your story interesting, because it's already interesting, but it's what helps it, that sharing that information is what helps it be interesting to other people, because it gives them something to hold on to, gives them something to connect to, and that's really important. So I encourage you to share your unique story, because I'm keen to hear it, and I'm sure other people are. I think this is incredibly important. I know it turns up in my bio in other places, but authenticity breeds trust. There's a lot of science around this. I think if you, there's this, I think this one's undeniable, and and it's also links back to stories of my childhood where, I think one of the most, people ask me, what would you tell 15-year-old you, Hannah? And I'd say that, the sooner you are yourself, the sooner you'll find a village of people that really like you just the way you are, and you won't have to pretend to be something that you're not really, because it turns out that they just like the thing that's not really you, and it takes a long time to find your real village. And I don't think that's different when it comes to telling stories. I think the more authentic you can be, the better people trust you. And I'm going to talk about lies in a minute, but people know when you're lying. That's what this, these gut feelings, that's the different, the understanding feelings and making behavioural changes and connecting with people. That's how these things work. It's these intimate connections in your brain. But I think, this whole believe in yourself and be yourself thing, I think is incredibly important. I can't stress the importance of sharing stories and sharing your own story, and sharing it in a real way, because the reality is that the struggles and challenges that you have in your story are likely not to be super different than other people, and I think that that's incredibly important. When you're telling a story, I think it's really important to be prepared, but I think it's important to not be too prepared. We've all seen probably a PhD student, maybe we haven't all, but many of us, get up to give a 3-minute thesis presentation and full-blown deer in the headlights. I mean, it happens with lots of things. There people over-prepare and they perhaps rote learn, or they think about it so much that they get up there and they start speaking. And we've probably all done it. I've definitely done it, where you start telling a story and then you have a second blank and you can't remember if you said the last thing you said. Like, you can't remember if the next thing and that's where the deer in the headlights moment comes out. I think there's some brilliant examples of it on YouTube and other places, and it's awful because you're so prepared and you knew exactly what you wanted to say in exactly the order. And then it's so robotic that all of a sudden, if you're distracted for a second, you can't remember where you're at. And because it's not free flowing, and because you need each bit in time, then often you can't remember the bit that comes next because you're so focused on what came before. And we see a lot of this over preparedness. I think nerves are really good. I told my boss last week that I was quite nervous about giving this presentation, and he said, well, nerves are good. They keep you real. And I think that that's really important. And we fundamentally, most of us are not professional presenters, and you still see newsreaders who do this for a living make mistakes. The reality is we're human. Making mistakes keeps us human. It's what defines us from robots, basically. And it's incredibly important. It's not something to be ashamed of. If you make a mistake, you just pick up and have another go. But I think there is something to be said for being too prepared, and I encourage you not to do that. I always like to flick through a bunch of my slides in the shower before I speak, thinking about the order. But do I know exactly every slide and what's on them? Probably not. I know what I want to say, and I've put a lot of thought into that, but I definitely haven't prepared the words I'm going to say on each slide. And I know that this is different for everybody, but I encourage you to get to a position where you feel confident but a bit nervous, because then you kind of get the best of both worlds, I think. This is, I think, another key tip, and that is that you don't have to be funny, but it sure helps. And why is that? Why is that the case? And obviously it's the reason why some people get paid, comedians, and some people don't. Me, which is absolutely fine. And it's when you look at the science, and this talks about privileged retrieval of information and being funny, and why it is that when someone's funny, you can actually retrieve that information more effectively. And it's all got to do with a change in behavioural state of your body, basically. And so, this is just one paper. There are many, not many, but there are a few in this space. And the reality is that when you smile, and when, firstly, there's the build-up, right? And comedians are brilliant at this, and they're brilliant at cycling back to get a second laugh, because we all know that sort of cyclic learning is incredibly important for remembering, right? That's why we do that when we lecture. We talk about a concept, and then a few months later, we come back around from that concept. And you can apply all of these things to your lectures too. It's exactly the same. But we do this cyclic thing, and comedians are brilliant about it. They'll remind you of the same joke 3 times, and they'll get 3 times as many laughs for the same joke, right, as they move through the process. But what is it about your ability to recall a joke? And actually, almost always, you can always remember the punchline, but you can't always remember the whole joke. And that is because during the lead up, you've sort of got this, you've got that, it's that tension and climax thing, right? You've got the building tension, they're telling you a story, you're kind of engaged in it. The climax moment, you probably laugh. If you don't laugh, you smile. And that causes all kinds of changes to your body, right? We know we're always told how many muscles it takes to smile and frown. So all of a sudden, all these things happen. When you laugh, there's like neurotransmitters in your brain, and there's all these changes on your face, and you might even move your body. And so all of a sudden your whole body's changed. And so there's this fully behavioural experience that comes with the story. And that's what you want to try and connect people to. You want them to have a full body experience when you're telling a great story. And a laugh's a really good way to do that. And often, I talk about this, and other people say, I'm just not very funny. And I'm like, well, don't tell a joke. You don't. There are lots of ways to go about this. I don't think that everybody has to tell a joke to give a good presentation. In fact, probably all of the best presentations I've seen didn't have any jokes in them. But it's a really good way to relax people. It's a good way to relax yourself. And it's a really good way to get people to connect to a really important message. If you can deliver a good punchline, but everybody can't, and that's fine. I talked about telling your real story earlier, and this just links directly to that. And that is that you should use real people and names and experiences where you can. And I know that sometimes, you have to say lawyer X instead of what you would want to say, or, there are reasons for not using people's name occasionally, right? Because, you might have clinical confidentiality, or you might not want to, giving up someone's name might tell you exactly who it is. But I encourage you to use real people where possible. And that is because it's more authentic. And you're not being authentic to the story or the reason you're here or any one of these things if you don't, and people know when you're not telling, I told you people know when you're lying, and they do. It just doesn't feel quite the same. And it's just one additional barrier between you and the person or the people or whatever the storytelling audience looks like. And you don't need those. There's no reason to change someone's name or to change elements of the story to make it more interesting, because it's probably already really interesting as it is. And so I encourage you to be as real as you possibly can in that moment. This is a good one, because I think we've all sat down with someone who wanted to share a story, and it turns out that they were just unpacking something really crap that happened to them. And you were just left feeling exhausted and kind of empathetic and tired. And, it wasn't a great experience. And people do that all the time. And I encourage you, when you're telling particularly you're telling a science story, you're wanting to share knowledge. I mean, there's lots of reasons why you would share an experience like this, and I don't discourage that. In fact, I think we should share difficult things more often, things like challenges around miscarriage and stillbirth and menopause and all kinds of things that are challenging, that we, perhaps taboo subjects that we don't talk about because they're hard. I encourage us to do that, but I don't encourage that when you're telling a story for someone's learning. And that is because what you don't want to do is leave them burdened at the end with anything apart from their thoughts and information. You don't want to leave them emotionally burdened from your own blowout. And so I encourage you not to use your story as a therapy session. And I think it's a really good one. When you're telling a story, this seems simple, right? But actually, I've already told you a version of this earlier around starting at the beginning and finishing at the end. And we know that Cinderella finishes that they all lived happily ever after, which is great news, because we know that they just didn't know about COVID yet. And then we say the end. And I told you, we don't bash people with the moral of the story. Why is that? And then I talked a bit about the moral of the story in Cinderella, and I said it could be this, or it could be around kindness, or it could be about being patient, or it could be about all kinds of things. But they never actually tell you what it is. And there's a good reason for that. And that is that moral might be different for everybody, right? How I feel about that story might be quite different to someone else's interpretation of that story. It might be a story of survivorship, or it might be a story of resilience, or, and for everybody it's different. And so when you get to the end of your scientific story, you should leave people in that moment of enjoying what they got from it. The worst possible thing you can do, probably, maybe, is take that away from them by telling them something different to what they got from the story. And so, imagine someone's had a great experience. You've told them this really important message around heart disease, and their interpretation was, that the story that you were telling them was for their grandmother. And at the end, you say to them, so what's really important is that you do this. And all of a sudden, all these good, positive thoughts that they've had about your story, where they've connected it to someone else, and they were thinking about making a change, are gone, because you've taken that experience away from them. Just don't do that. Let them take away their own part of the story. I think that a good storyteller probably has a number of, there are a number of key messages in their story. And you can, you get the opportunity to share those, and people get the opportunity to take away from what they do. And that's just how it goes. There's no need to ruin a really good story with a message that undoes your really good story. I think that this one is probably a fairly common, problem with stories. And that is that the devil is really in the details of a great story. And often when it comes to science, the details are really boring. The bits of the story that you think you share because it was important to you, like you did, and this happens in papers all the time. I think I definitely have experienced it writing up an academic paper where I did an experiment and it was so important. Nothing really good happened, but like it was hard and it felt like it was critical, and it turns out it wasn't. But you want to try and squash it in the story because you want to show people you did it, because like there was a lot of heartache and tears associated with that. But it doesn't make your story better. I encourage you to leave it out, and it's interesting. Like, and I think this comes back to a really important lesson that I learned in my last role when I was looking after communications and marketing, and a brilliant young girl in my team, young woman, who would always tell me from a design perspective that you know, your work wasn't complete unless there was nothing else that could be taken off. You know, there was nothing else that could be removed or taken away, and that it was pared back to only the important things. And, you know, that's critical from a design perspective and from a ability to create beauty and functionality, but it's also really important from a storytelling perspective. And in fact, we've probably all done it as supervisors or as science storytellers too, in that left something out knowing that it will trigger someone to ask a question. And that's a brilliant reason to leave out a few details, is that because after you've finished speaking, the very best reward for telling a great story is that someone engages with you, that someone asks you a question, or that someone wants to be part of that conversation. And you can do that by leaving out a few details. So I encourage you to do that, because honestly, bashing through details is very uninteresting. I think you should remember the audience are always on your side. You know, if they've turned up to something you're speaking at, or if they, you know, even if they're forced to, they're there for a moment. And so you've got the opportunity to capture them. You don't have to win them over. You've already got them. Just don't lose them. And I think there are some good tips along the way to go about that. And then I think fundamentally, you know, rules are made for breaking. You know, when I talked about the art and science on my first slide, and you know, that these are really guidelines. There's no science to this. You know, these are just things that work successfully for me. But I encourage you to test and trial some of these things, and to test and trial other things. You know, I told you early on, I said, you know, in Cinderella, they don't bash you with a message, and the best messages are subtle. And then I gave you this very unsubtle message in a pink box. You know, I think finding a mixture of all of these things as you go is incredibly important, and you can work out what works for you. And I think fundamentally, more important than anything, that the best stories create wonder. You know, the wonder is what drives me to think about science, what connects me with the world, what makes me want to share things with other people, what makes me want to listen to other people's stories, is the wonder that's created in the moment of sharing. And, you know, I encourage you to think about that. And I encourage you to share the things that create wonder for you, the things that blow your mind, that make you think about the world differently. You know, those are brilliant opportunities for sharing, because they enrich people's life. So I told you I wasn't going to get, you know, that you really shouldn't use a moral to the story. So here's me doing exactly that, because I told you that rules are made for breaking. And the reality is that it's very simple. You know the reason you're here, you know your purpose, know what inspires you to be here, and share the why, share that behavior, feeling, connection moment with people, because that'll have you you'll be on their side from the beginning. And tell your story. You know, think about what it is that you want to share, and then work out what that looks like, and share it, and share it often. And that is all from me. Thank you.
Many thanks, Hannah. I got a whole lot from that. I've been making notes to help me follow that better. But we need someone more experienced in communication than me to take apart some of what you said and engage and generate some questions. So I'll introduce Dr. Jen Martin. Jen spent many years studying sex life of possums, among other zoological questions. These days, she's an award-winning lecturer. She founded and teaches the University of Melbourne's highly acclaimed science communication program, and I supervised a bunch of those students. I really enjoyed doing that. Many of you know Dr. Jen from her weekly segment, Weird Science, on 3RRR Breakfasters. If you don't, go and find that right now. Jen's on tomorrow at 7:45, is that correct? And also been a co-host for many years in 3RRR's popular Sunday science show, Einstein A Go-Go. So over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Hannah. Oh my goodness, I feel like you and I could talk for about 15 years non-stop, because you were lucky that I had my camera turned off, because otherwise I would have been really distracting to everyone, just going, yeah, I really agree. So thank you so much. I do feel like there's just so much I'd love to talk with you about. And anyone who starts off by telling us that two of the things they're most passionate about in the world is storytelling and good cake, I mean, you know, that's just a match made in heaven for me. And I guess you and I sort of bonded a little bit last week when you made a comment on Twitter about that you think that essentially, good science communication is really just good communication. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's something that I'd love to unpack maybe with our audience as well. Why do we think that science is its own thing? Is it just because it comes with its own language or its own set of assumptions? Well, lots of things have their own language and their own sets of knowledge. And, I think that's a really interesting question. And I guess what you've just demonstrated to us, that the basics of good communication are maybe not that complex and not that difficult, but they just take some practice and they take some thought. So thank you for the wonderful piece of communication you've just shown us. And like Jeff, I've scribbled lots of things down. And I think what you've just said is so important, because my day job is teaching science students how to be more effective and more engaging communicators. And often that comes down to, a lot of them have heard this phrase, you need to tell a story. You've got to tell it like a story. And for a lot of them who've studied science all their lives, their response to that is, I don't know what that means. Does that mean once upon a time there was a girl called Jen who studied possums? Probably not. That's probably not what it means. And it means a whole lot of other really useful things that, that you've just told us. And this idea of the value of oral storytelling, I think, is just so important. And Jeff, that's where you and I know each other from. That's the beauty of science on radio. How do we tell a story that's going to stay in the oral tradition for thousands of years? I mean, what a thing to aspire to. I feel like I should put that on my LinkedIn profile. I want to tell a story so good that it still exists in thousands of years. But I think some of the key takeaways for me, and things that I certainly try and teach my students, are this idea that it's not about us. And I think one of the beauties of recognizing it's not about you, it's about you forming a connection with your audience, is that for people who really struggle with nerves, which, let's face it, for a lot of people, nerves are a big problem. And I couldn't agree more that nerves are good, and nerves show that you care. And if you're not nervous about something, why are you doing it? Because it probably doesn't mean very much to you. But if you can get, to this point of recognizing that it's not about you, it's about the story that you're sharing, and that the kind of dance that you can have with your audience, the connection you can forge with them, that probably humor is going to be a part of, it just takes off so much pressure, I think, when we recognize it's not about us. So I love that was one of your key messages. And yes, the audience is on your side. People don't want you to fail. One of the key things I always say to people is just smile. If it all goes really badly wrong, just smile, and it creates this sense of empathy with your audience. I don't know, Hannah, do you find that just, smiling, it really helps?
Oh, sure. And, I think that, and we also, I think along with the smile is the fact that we so often, you're so often encouraged to stand behind a podium. In fact, that's often where the microphone is, right? And so there's already this barrier between you and them. And, so it's really hard to build that connection. It's hard to sort of build that empathy. But if you're standing out there, people have a bit of respect for that, and it's why I always, this isn't my preferred platform. And I love to be able to, sitting on a stool in the middle of the stage with a handheld microphone, because one, I think great stories are told sitting down. I think that, that the best stories in history were not orated. They were told by building a connection, and that's how good bedtime stories are told. Your parents don't stand over you and scream a bedtime story. It's about connection, and there are lots of ways to do that, and you can connect. There's more empathy when they can see you and they realize, they know that you're putting yourself out there and you're standing up there, and that there's lots of ways to build that connection. And it's it's hard. I think the other thing is that this is just one skill. We as everybody, we all learn so many skills. I know that everybody's not a scientist on the call today, but the reality is, like, even in any career, like, you have to learn so many skills, and this is just another one. And you don't hold yourself back because I'm not brilliant at Excel, for example. I like Excel, but I'm not brilliant at it. I don't judge myself because I'm not so good at that. Public speaking is not different to that. Crafting your stories is just one skill in your sort of tool set. And, you work on that like you work on flow cytometry or mass spec or any one of these things,
Absolutely. And I guess, that's what I've kind of staked my whole career on, that I can get any student to be a very, very competent, if not fantastic public speaker, just by making them practice. And my students would tell you, I don't let them stand behind the podium. It's actually not allowed in my classes to stand behind a podium, which, is very confronting for sure, coming out and being right in front of your audience. But I think it's so important. The other thing I just loved with your talk was this focus on sharing. And it reminds me of a good friend of mine, Sarah Phillips, who some of you may know. She used to be with the ABC. She's now with Nature Springer. And Sarah's a wonderful science communicator, an amazing writer. And she introduced me to this idea of the Hey Martha test. And the Hey Martha test is where you picture this gorgeous elderly couple sitting down at their breakfast table, sitting there with their cups of tea. They've been married for 70 years. They barely need to speak to one another. They know exactly what the other person is thinking, but they're sitting down there with their newspapers. And there's, Bob sitting there with his newspaper, and he reads something that really excites him so much and interests him so much that he bothers to look up from his paper and say, "Hey, Martha, did you know blah, blah, blah?" And so for me, that Hey Martha test, I think, is such a good test for science communicators. Is your story going to be something that, you're going to look up from your newspaper and want to share? And maybe the equivalent now is sharing on Facebook or whatever it is. But I don't know, the Hey Martha test has really stayed with me for many years.
And, it's that Hey Martha moment that is the reason I hate the term psychom. Because... I tested this. I told a few of you yesterday, and I tested this out on my wife first because I thought I was just feeling a bit angry about it, and that I'd been locked down, and I've been in my house for 6 months, and I had a really good chat with my mum about it, actually, who I bounce a lot of things off because she's not a scientist. She takes a very scientific approach to lots of things, like buying a washing machine, for example. But she weighs up all the bits and pieces, and she's a critical thinker, but really different. And I tried to explain to her what frankly pissed me off so much, and it was because I talk when I think about myself, when I'm sharing stories with people, no matter what, I don't think of myself as a psychom person. I think of myself in that moment. And so, the option I described to her was this moment of sharing, of talking about COVID with my grandfather. And, in that moment, I was talking about science, but it wasn't psychom. It was being a granddaughter, right? And, and it was about, it's about audience and all of those other things. But I think fundamentally my role as a granddaughter or my role as a daughter I talk to my nephew about science all the time. It's not science communication. It's living. Like it's just me being me. And like I don't want to be defined by titles. I don't think we should be defined by titles. I think that, sharing and being generous and making generous assumptions about what other people know and how they go about things, that's just the fundamentals of my existence. It doesn't need a title. I'm in a same-sex marriage, but that doesn't need a title for me. It's just marriage, right? And but these other things are not different. Good communication, whether you're talking about marketing or baking or science, is just good communication. And there's this for the I'd rather people perfected their communication skills across the board and became great communicators talking about whatever it is, whether it's their relationship or sexual dysfunction or science. Like, but the same rules apply to everything. And so I don't, I just hate that we sort of pigeonhole, well, you think of yourself as a good communicator, but you're not good at science communication. It doesn't make sense to me. And so, I just like to think of it as, stories and communicating, because it resonates with me. There's no pigeonhole.
And I think exactly what you've just said is one of the reasons why language is actually a big issue, because it's such an easy throwaway line. Anyone who's done any form of science communication training will have been told, don't use jargon, but it's much more nuanced than that. And I think this whole idea that we have a set of terms which we use with one another is fine. If you're talking to someone who has the same set of terms that are familiar to them and they understand them, it's fine. Jargon is only jargon for the wrong audience. But when we try and communicate more broadly and we use language that is really, that really excludes people, it's just such a big problem. And as you said, titles really matter. You know, a title is how you grab somebody's attention, is how you convince somebody this is going to be worth reading or worth listening to. And there was a study that came out not that long ago that got reported in Nature, some of you may have seen, talking about language, and the stats were terrible. It was, so they looked at something like 18 million abstracts between 1960 and 2018, and they looked at how language had changed in scientific papers. And, you know, over that time, it's become chronic in terms of more difficult words, longer words with more syllables, more technical language, longer sentences, things that people just can't understand. And one of the stats that really stood out to me was they looked at how many acronyms people are using. And I think it was nearly 80% of abstracts in the scientific literature during that period had an acronym in it. But something like equally 80% of those acronyms had been used less than 10 times in the scientific literature, ever. So we're making up acronyms all the time that no one can understand, and then no one else uses them anyway. I mean, I think this whole, as you said, it's just for wankers, the language that we use.
That whole scientific writing thing, you know, learn to be a better scientific writer. Like basically, like my journey to scientific writing was to learn to be a worse writer, like a much worse writer. And I've had to work over, you know, not that my PhD supervisor, who could be on the call, I have no idea, was a bad writer. He was a beautiful scientific writer. Like, you know, it was clear and concise and all of these things. But I was always being told, like, no one's interested in the history of that, or no one's interested in that story. And I think that this is how I always knew that I was meant to be somewhere that wasn't purely academia. Like, it wasn't academic writing, because I didn't like it. Like, I didn't like that I couldn't share something, like I couldn't share the journey. I couldn't, you know, it didn't allow me to do that. The reality is I tried to write a paper like that. I tried to really go at it with the best story I could write, and it got ugly rejected, right? Like ugly. They were like, this is the worst. This is not, does not read like a scientific paper. And so we have to conform to some rules, because that's what people now expect. But I would love to see people really pushing the barriers on that and thinking about how they craft a great paper that people actually want to read. Because if you can write a paper where I actually want to read your introduction, like, I'm happy to send beers and chocolates to those people. I don't read introductions because they're not interesting. There's nothing in there for me. Like, it's not for the reader. I don't know who it's written for, but it's not interesting. Well, you know, if you're reading a paper, you probably know everything that's in the introduction, with the exception of maybe what the hypothesis is. So I look for those 2 lines. You know, write from the heart, like, write things that are important to you, and see if you can get them through the process. Certainly as an editor, you know, as a journal reviewer these days, I encourage people to do that. I never comment on that stuff, because, you know what, I want people to explore what's possible and to write things that people want to read. You know, I think it's incredibly important. We've got so many words in the English language, and we use so few of them in science. You know, we use this whole nother language that's uninterpretable and uninteresting, and we don't use the really cool and interesting terms that are considered to be non-scientific. I want to see more of that.
Which is, I think, why one of your points is just so important about what you can leave out. If you talk to my students about what are the 3 things I ask them most often, the first would be, what's the problem you're trying to solve? The second would be, why does it matter? And the third would be, what can you leave out when you explain it? Because, I mean, yeah, we just get so hung up on details. Now, I can see there's questions from the audience, so I'm going to stop hogging you, Hannah, but I just wanted to make one last point, and that is that I think your call to action around being authentic is just music to my ears, because so much of what I'm working with my students is imposter syndrome, this sense of I don't belong, I don't know enough, I'm not worthy, people know more than me, why would anyone listen to me or read what I'm saying? And it's just so important, your point that you made about, it's just about being ourselves and about acknowledging that we do have thoughts and knowledge and ideas of value to share. And it's about being real people with real experiences, not spinning new things, just actually being ourselves and telling our stories, and trusting that the people will connect with that and will learn from that. And the more honest we can be around who we are and why we do our work and why we're passionate about it, I just think it's a call to arms that I want all scientists to hear. And, you know, that's how we create wonder. Like you said, it's about wonder. I always think about this word awesome. You know, we use awesome so incorrectly all the time. Oh, that was just so awesome. what does it really mean? It's about awe. And I think science has the power to really, really draw out a sense of awe in human beings. And what a wonderful thing for science storytellers to be able to do. So everyone, listen to Hannah. Let's just be ourselves and share what we do and why we do it. It's just such an honour.
And on that imposter syndrome thing, right, there's actually no, like, I've not yet been able to Google the rule book on who belongs and does not belong in science. You know, I know that there's a few people getting around with an impression in their head about what it looks like, but they're assholes. And the reality is the science is about new things, right? It's about going in places that we haven't gone before. And so that's what scientists should look like. You know, it's, you know, and I still think of myself as a scientist. I do science every day, despite the fact that I'm not an academic, you know, and it's all of these things. You know, there isn't just one version that belongs. You know, I know that that these days that the rules on how you can stay there, belonging there, are changing, and you know, but we also accept that they're not that good. You know, the metrics by which we measure ourselves as belonging are shit. And so, you know, this whole I don't belong here because I imposter syndrome is a combination of not feeling like you belong plus nerves, right? And nerves are normal and nerves are good, and not feeling like you belong, that's just an archaic thing for assholes, and we're not abiding to that anymore. You know, I never have, but the reality is that's not a thing. You know, so if we can stamp that out today from everybody, that would be great. Just move forward with no imposter syndrome and recognize that we've never seen anyone called out. Like, I've never, ever, my whole life, you know, if I'm counting all of the counting all of the examples, I've never seen anyone say, you know what, you don't belong to be here. You're not smart enough. You're not science enough. You're not any one of those things. It doesn't happen. We all belong here, and there's space for everybody, and there's space for people who do it really differently.
Here.
So thanks, Jen, for stimulating that conversation. I think, talking about what you just mentioned, that authenticity, what I like to hear personally in a talk is someone describing passionately about the eureka moment, that, you know, that the highs and then the lows, saying things like, this was really frustrating, we couldn't get it done. And it's like there's potentially builds an empathy between the audience and you, and it's not just dry science, it's science, but emotional, and also what drives you as a person to actually enjoy and sometimes not enjoy doing it. There's also a question at the moment from Natasha de Alvis, who asks for Hannah, what do you think about how COVID is currently being communicated to the public?
Oh, look, it's really an unprecedented time, isn't it? I'm glad we started with the easy question. I looked at that and I thought, I hope we don't get around to that, because that's hard. Look, I make generous assumptions, and I think people have probably done their best. Probably the smart and capable people around me have probably done their best. And I think that exists always. And I think that the people that you should trust for information, and the people who, you know, we would all identify as trustworthy sources, and the people who, you know, and there's a whole nother day to talk about how we teach other people or how we share with people what trustworthy sources look like, so they can work out fact from fiction. But I would say that I think that the people that I trust to do a good job of sharing information, and the places that I would go to look for information, I think that they've done a really good job. I think that, you know, I and then of course there's always the other stuff, right? There's always the noise. There's always the people, you know, communicating and saying that this isn't real and this isn't a thing, and social media makes, you know, and the online world makes these things incredibly difficult, because if you've got just a few sources saying things loud but not particularly loud about, you know, and communicating really effectively, and you've got the converse, you've got thousands of people saying, you know, I'm sick of being locked down, this isn't real, it's no worse than the flu, blah blah blah. We're happy to fact check all of that stuff for anyone seeing this on the internet later, around the fact that this is a real phenomenon and it's really bad and we're doing a great job to fight it. You know, that's noisy. And so getting really good, strong communication messages up and above the noise is really hard. And it's hard in COVID, and it's hard everywhere. This is not a new challenge. What do I think we've done well? I think we've stuck to a few strong key messages. You know, to the person who coined flatten the curve early on, and but more importantly to the to the individual who drew that, the person who cattoned the curve, I don't know their name, I apologize, but someone brilliantly did that, who connected a scientific concept with with something that people actually resonate with, the people who thought about this right in the early days, and they turned it into language that people understood. You can see a picture of a curve, and generally speaking, whether you know science or don't know science, you know the difference between not flat and flat, right? We look at those things all the time. And so, I think they've done a good job. I think we couldn't, health hasn't, I'm fascinated by health and health communication, health marketing. That's the thing that's really important to me. And have we ever been so effective about the importance of health? Absolutely not. I think, we have never been, have we ever been able to change people's behavior in a period of time responsive to a health message? No, we absolutely haven't. And I mean, obviously, I think what it shows is the strength of key health messages and legislation, right? Like if we want to make big changes as a result of science, you need the partnership between good messaging, scientists, really good messaging, and, some really creative and thoughtful people who are marketing and comms and those kind of experts, and policymakers, right? Like what we've seen in this space is that you have a good message, you have people who can craft a good message, and you have people who can impact change, and you put them together, and look, we can all make changes for health. And if we did that for environment and climate and all of these other things, if we could get the right people to sort of sync up and recognize that we've got this terrible thing happening, I think, we're going to be in a really good place. But we don't. And so we have to work out how to do that. But have the messages been good, and have we communicated effectively? I think so. Even yesterday, I'm going to use Dan Andrews as an example because he's the one I see most often. He put up a post yesterday about breaking down some of the terms that they use. He posted on his social media that has a big following, some of the terms that they use to describe these things every day. Have we seen that in health, or have we seen that in politics before? I don't think so. I think that people have been smarter about this in general, probably because they've had to be, and they've had to pull the right people together. I just wish we had more opportunities to do it. I see the changes that have been made, and the way people think, and in general, how people have responded. And I'm so proud. Like, I'm proud of science, and I'm proud of communicators, and I'm proud of policymakers for all the things we've seen. I just wish I knew how to pull all those people into a room to prioritize some of the other things that I was really passionate about. But yeah.
Oh, we just got another question from John Cripps Clark. This may relate to kind of the flatten the curve ideas. The way he says, without the way that science finds out new ideas is not always narrative. Faraday started with a diagram. How can we convey the nature and excitement of science without straitjacketing it into a story?
There are lots of ways to tell a story, right? I don't even remember who was telling me the story, and it might have been a colleague that I used to work with, Eliza, or it might have been someone else, around the fact that the military still have people who draw all of their things. So, when they're talking about, a new piece of technology or a new equipment, they still have someone who draws. And I think that in a very, and I think that that's amazing. And we're not talking about people who necessarily use like high-end digital technologies and crafts. These are people who still drawing with paper and pens, and I think that's extraordinary, because I don't think I think we desperately don't want to lose some of those extraordinary crafts and talents. But I think that we, in a world of accessibility, your question is more important than ever, and that is that everybody can't hear, and so an oral story is just one option. But we do need to consider what that looks like for people, and I think we've seen, for the people who can't hear, I think we've seen during the COVID pandemic more than ever, the importance of bringing the right people to the table to help with messaging. And, we see text on videos and descriptions of images for people who can't see. And, we are doing this better. I don't know, I'm giving all kinds of things plugs today that I probably shouldn't, but if you watch the Kathy Freeman documentary a few weeks ago, and if you haven't, you should, they had a person that narrated the imagery that was independent from the storyteller, but someone else who described the pictures. And it didn't, like, my wife and I talked about it sort of as we got into it. I was like, oh, there's someone describing what's being seen. And I didn't realize for the first time that I was actually experiencing this other kind of accessibility that I hadn't seen before. But, I think all of the components of stories are critical. And I think based on your audience, they're really important, right? You know, if you're telling a story, if you're explaining the importance of washing your hands to kids around COVID, you know, a video might be brilliant, or, you know, a game or a picture book, or, you know, all of these things, you know, are key to the story. And I like to think about these things and what audiences see, and, you know, where they see information too. I think, you know, if you're trying to, you know, maybe we'll all end up making TikTok videos about health. I don't know, you know, it seems to be very popular, and, you know, there are people spreading messages that are viral. And wouldn't it be lovely if we could find ways to make really important health and environment messages go viral like that? You know, we don't have the control over that, and unfortunately we can't decide why it is that people love cat videos or any one of these things. But, you know, I agree entirely. You know, it doesn't need to be, a story can look very different. You know, a story might be a 3-part cartoon. It could be, you know, a story can be a single one-line message. You know, if you can get it out like that, I wholeheartedly encourage you to do that too.
Thanks, Hannah. Neera, do you have a question for Hannah?
I do. Thank you for that excellent presentation. I really thank you for your honesty and your novel presentation. I want to pick up on some of the points you made just recently around policy and policy making and policy around that. I come from a legal profession, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from your presentation and storytelling, and the way that the legal profession can learn to communicate better. And I think with a lot of the legal profession, there is this fine balance between this art of performance when you're in court and performing, and I call it performing because I think it is somewhat performing when you're before a judge and in a court. But I also think that there's a real need for a lot of what you've spoken about with storytelling and breaking down this idea of how we communicate legal information. And there's a lot that's already been written about legal verbosity and legal verbiage, and there's so many words that we use in the law that we just don't need to use. And if you look at legal judgments sometimes, and I've been in the legal profession for 20 years, and you still have to read a judgment 3 times because there's one sentence where there's a double negative, and you read it and then you have to reread it. And it comes back to the point you were making of say something in the simplest way that people can understand it. So I'd really like your thoughts on extending what you've said in your presentation beyond science. You know, have you got any thoughts on extending these ideas around easier communication to other disciplines, such as the law?
Look, I mean, I have lots because, you know, it's funny because I often look up to the people who can get up and confidently, you know, I think of lawyers and barristers and people who get up and confidently just blast, right? And they go and they go and they seem to have the narrative in touch. And, you know, and there's part of me that looks and thinks, God, that's brilliant. And it's the same, you know, when I see politicians get up and give a 3-minute spiel, you know, and I think back to some very, quite a famous blowout from Julia Gillard, which is incredibly inspiring. But there are many others. And, you know, I think about the way that they get up and they confidently deliver. But what I think I like is the delivery. You know, it's confident and it's passionate, and confidence and passion, like those are things I totally get behind. The use of like exclusive language, that's just as wankery, whether it's in law or in science. You know, I think, you know, and the reality is if there are people in the room, and in a courtroom, there will be members of the general public sitting there. It's like, you know, I lived in a foreign country twice, and I definitely experienced people speaking a foreign language in front of me so I couldn't understand what they were saying. In one case, I was in a country where they didn't know I spoke a different language, and they spoke a language which I understood as French. I was living in America, and they spoke French in front of me to cut me out of the conversation. And they said something derogatory about my friend, and I blasted them back in French, in the tongue that they were speaking. But it's like that, right? it's like having a conversation, you're using that language in a room where there are people where you know they don't understand all the words. That is the perfect example. You know, if you're writing something if you're speaking in front of a broad audience, or you're writing something for a broad audience, how dare you write something that people don't get? Like, talk about being just an asshole.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? Like, what is the inspiration for excluding people on something that you know about that they don't? You know, it's that secret thing. It's that thing we encourage kids not to do. It's that, it speaks to everything that I don't love. You know, it's the passion and the, you know, and the confidence and the, you know, and often driven by getting the best for someone who desperately needs it. Like, I'm all for that. The use of language that means that everybody in the room doesn't know what you're doing, I think that's awful. I think there's a lot to learn from that. And I think that, you know, it's that law is not the only place where that happens. In fact, it happens a lot. You know, I sit in a lot of conversations where I still don't know all the terms. And I think, you know, it comes to that whole dumbing it down thing, right? Which that concept makes me mad, because you're not dumbing it down.
Yeah.
You're making it accessible. And the reality is the only idiot is you if you can't use language that everybody uses. You know, there are ways to describe every concept with regular language. I encourage people to do it at every opportunity that they have, because why would you use a foreign? It's like me, if I wanted to talk about the intricacies of a scientific paper and I was doing it to primary school kids, I could talk about it in science language. I may as well do it in French, right? Like, why would I do that? Why would I have a conversation with people where I know that they don't understand? Like that.
Yeah. No, I agree with you totally. I
Yeah.
do. I think it's really refreshing. Your presentation was really refreshing, and I think it comes to impact. And we talk in universities so much about research and about your research having impact. And I think it comes back to your points around communication, and to have the greatest impact and to reach the broadest and the widest members of society. You have to be able to communicate well, and I think your presentation hit that issue on the head. You did that you communicated that well in your presentation on communication. So
I'm glad and it's funny you mentioned impact, because I think I've worked out what that is. I know this is it's been very elusive. People have been talking about impact for a while now. We don't know what it is, and it's actually just that final transaction. Like, it's actually taking the knowledge or the thing or whatever you've got and giving it to the person, right? And giving it to them so it's meaningful to them. And so the reason it's hard to measure is because how do you measure that? Like, we're talking about measuring impact and the value of these things. Like, that's incredibly difficult. But fundamentally, if you've got a piece of knowledge, the impact is when you hand it over and when they can turn it into something. It might be them changing their behavior or changing the way they think, or any one of these things, but that transaction has to occur. And you know what, it's really hard to measure that, because you could go around, you could put together a social media marketing campaign and share a message, but you could have a really meaningful conversation with 5 people, and that might be way more impactful, because it might actually change their behavior and influence something completely different. And so impact's really hard to measure, but it's not really hard to do. It's just making sure that last transaction happens, that when you have something that you need to share, that you share it, and that you do it in a way that's useful and beneficial and generous to the person on the other end.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks Nira, and thanks Hannah, Dr. Jen and Tao for this for setting up this extremely interesting conversation this morning. And I hope everybody, scientists, non-scientists, member of the public, gains something about how to communicate what they know about to people that outside their family, outside their sphere, outside their place of work. So thanks again, Hannah, some great messages, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. And don't forget to, we'll be having a further Healthy Futures seminar in just a few weeks' time, and you'll be hearing about that very soon. So keep watching. Thanks, everyone.